The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 97.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library,
the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book
that will enable you to grow personally and professionally.
Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Thank you for joining us on the EL. Today we have Tiffani Lennon, author of Recognizing Women's Leadership, Strategies and Best Practices for Employing Excellence. Welcome, Tiffani, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thank you, Wade. It's my pleasure.
Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself? Tell us just a little bit about you personally.
Sure. I am an attorney and researcher for Colorado Women's College of the University of Denver. I'm a faculty member. I chaired the Law and Society program at the University of Denver as well.
Excellent. And thank you for sharing that. Now, let's jump right into your book, Recognizing Women's Leadership, which was actually just made available for purchase back in August of 2014. And Tiffani, we're going to move quickly, but our whole point is to cover the top questions that our listener/reader wants to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing your book?
Let's see. Let me think here. I would say probably in April of 2012, Marie C. Wilson, who was the founder of the White House Project, also she was the founder of Ms. Magazine Foundation. She was the woman that, started Take Your Daughter to Work Day. She was the woman that had the first Barbie doll, ensured that the first Barbie doll actually was a presidential Barbie doll. In other words, rather than your typical Barbies where, she's a fashion model or she's a nurse or a teacher, she really advocated and had the presidential Barbie, right, to try to give young girls the image of what it means that a woman can and can't do. And so she approached us and said, we did this first study. It got a lot of traction. It got a lot of interest. We need another study. We need an updated study. We need a study that really looks at where women are sitting in positional leadership roles. She said, would you be willing to do this? And I said, sure. And so that's pretty much how that happened.
Great. So what makes your book different from others regarding the same or similar topic?
Well, here's the thing. I think other books really talk about, try to give explanation as to why women are not doing as well, what women could do differently. And what we really did was we did a descriptive study, meaning we looked at the major industries in the United States, the top companies within those major industries, and we looked at where women actually sat in leadership roles. And we also looked at what they were earning compared to men. And then we looked at, for each one of those industry standards, we looked at how they're doing in comparison to their male counterparts. And so we really actually found out and told the reader how women are doing. We compared apples to apples, and we compared them to their male counterparts. And I think the other books basically do a lot of speculation and a lot of personal stories and accounts on what may or may not be working and why that is. Instead, we really looked at what is the case and how are women doing.
So how do you suggest the reader actually engage with your book? Is this one that they can jump in and jump out, cherry picking information, or should they really start from the beginning and read all the way through?
They can cherry pick information, or they can start from the beginning. And I welcome a skeptical reader, a reader that thinks, oh, geez, women aren't doing that bad. I see them in the workplace. And many of those critics are women themselves. And so when I've talked about this book around the country, some of my biggest critics are women saying, no, that just can't be true. We can't really be earning still 80 cents on the dollar. People are naturally skeptical. They really can't believe what we found. And what we found we didn't do a sampling. We literally looked at what is and what was in 2013 in terms of where women sat and what their pay discrepancies were.
So Tiffani, this is my favorite part of the interview, and this is where I just want to hand over the mic and allow you to take a deep dive into your book. And if you can imagine that this is a busy entrepreneur on their way home, possibly, or walking on the treadmill, and really looking to figure out or know, is this my next great read? So will you take us through it?
Yes. So here's the deal. The best part about this book is at the end, we looked at the top performing companies in the United States. We looked at Google. We looked at Walmart. We looked at TIAA CREF. We looked at Xerox, right? Some of the biggest top performing companies, mostly public rather, except for TIAA-CREF. And what we did was we wanted to find out what made them as good as they were. They also happen to have a sufficient, and in some cases, the highest percentage of women leaders in their companies. And we found a set of best practices to ensure the best and brightest rise and perform to their optimal levels. And frankly, any entrepreneur, if they're serious about growing their business, if they're serious about doing well, they should and want to know what these companies have done to ensure that they have the best talented workforce. When we looked at entrepreneurship, so there's a whole chapter dedicated to entrepreneurship. When we looked at that chapter, what we found is that women entrepreneurs are not receiving the same level of investment as male entrepreneurs. Right? None of that is deeply surprising. Many entrepreneurs, I think, would find that is in fact the case. And so when we looked at that, we looked at who were investing in entrepreneurs. And we created a list of the top investors in startup companies in the U.S. And we looked at who they were investing in, why they were investing in them. And what we found is that oftentimes investors were more likely to invest in companies that look like them. Most of the investors would chase after the same kinds of companies. And so many investors really need to consider not the same old, right? It almost is like everyone gets on the same bandwagon for a particular company and seeks to invest and fuel that particular company, which I understand to some degree, but really there were a great number of companies that went unfunded, uninvested in, that ended up doing exceptionally well. And so that's on the entrepreneurship chapter. We looked at 14 chapters. That's one of them. On another side is we looked at higher ed, for example, and K-12 education. And what we found was that in very institutionalized sectors like education, like banking is another one, where there has been long-standing structures in place, what we found is that women were less likely to receive an equitable pay, that the pay gap was more predominant in those industries than in brand new industries, right? In the tech sector, for example, there you had women who were able to close the pay gap, were able to close the positional leadership roles, which is really interesting because, again, in banking and some of the more traditional roles like higher ed, some of the pay gap was as common as it was in the 1980s, right? Still an 80% pay to the male's salary. So one of the things that I think we can understand from this and why female entrepreneurs may want to know is that there are opportunities for advancement for women, particularly in new sectors like technology. So that is one way to understand that data. I think another way to understand the data is that really what we're looking at are long-term systems and structures that are in place that really create impediments, gatekeeping, if you will, in the industry. And, we see some of that gatekeeping as well in entrepreneurship in terms of external investors. Moving along in the technology field, I alluded to it, and I'll talk a bit more about that now. Really what we see in the technology field is that women are really able to, not only close the gap, but are really closing in on performance. So I keep mentioning performance. And the reason why we looked at performance is because, I don't know about you, Wade, but for me, I really my first immediate question when I started to look at the pay differential was, well, how are women doing then compared to their male counterparts? How is it that they're still earning 80% on the dollar on average? And so I was compelled to look at performance. I was compelled to look at industry standards and try to uncover and understand how women are doing. I did not expect to find that women are comparably performing to their male counterparts, and in some cases, excelling. And, it's really no surprise, because I think any group that is not in the majority would say that they have to do better to be recognized and be noticed. So in that way, it's really not surprising. But nonetheless, I was surprised to find that that was the case. And so if you look at, we can jump now to the medical field, right? And looking at hospitals, for example. In 2011, female CEOs earned 57% of what their male CEOs earned at top grossing nonprofit hospitals, right? I mean, whereas the average is 80%, in some sectors, when you compared apples to apples, sometimes the pay discrepancy was far greater than a 20% differential. When we looked at, looking at female CEOs in medical schools and on faculty, we're looking at literally, females in the leadership positions on medical schools. We're looking at about 25.5% of the top leadership roles are occupied by women. Again, not really a proportionate representation at all. And one of the myths, I think, surrounding a lot of this is that there aren't enough women in the pipeline. And honestly, there are. There have been a sufficient number of women in the pipeline. In fact, in business, we know that women make up over 50% of the workforce. It's about 52%. And women are overrepresented in middle management roles. So we know that women are there. We know that women are rising in leadership positions, but we also know that they get capped. And so it's the same old story, really, in many ways. And so, what is the motivation for people to want to do things differently in the workforce? I think the motivation is that when you ensure that the best and brightest rise, women naturally rise, right? Women and men of color rise in the leadership ranks. When the companies, and this is how the last couple of chapters of my book really emphasize this point. When a company emphasizes performance, and here's the thing, Wade, every company thinks that they emphasize performance. Every company thinks that they promote and hire based upon credentials and performance. And what we found, even in the top companies in the US, they don't. They think they do, but they really don't. And the level of subjectivity that's involved is so heavily present that it really impedes the company. The company is its own worst enemy. And so when they focus on hiring the best and brightest, and when they focus on promoting the best and brightest, the company excels. And that was a finding I did not expect to have. And I mentioned a couple of these industries: medicine, education. Again, we looked at 14 sectors. These are just a couple that I mentioned to show that, in fact, the pipeline is there. Women are moving up. There is a overrepresentation of women in middle management roles. But yet when you start to go into the leadership roles, and not just the C-suite, the CEO, the CFO, the COO, but the executive senior leadership team, which in the average company would range anywhere between 30 and 60 positions, sometimes more. It is at that level where women are not penetrating. And so it's an interesting conundrum. Slightly more than half of the workforce, an overrepresentation in middle management, and yet this very obvious gap in the leadership ranks. And yet women are, in many cases, outperforming their male counterparts with less resources, like for entrepreneurs, for example. They're doing exceptionally well despite the little resources that are actually given to women in general. And so it behooves a company, it behooves an organization to actually invest in their talent to actually look at performance and ensure that the best and brightest are being promoted, are being hired, are incentivized within the company, because it only serves them.
So Tiffani, if based on what you just said, is that the one, or let me ask it this way, if the reader could only get one takeaway from your entire book, everything that you've been discussing with us, what would you want that to be?
It would be to ensure that people focus on performance, that people focus on hiring the best and brightest and promoting the best and brightest. And as a result, women and men of color rise naturally.
Do you feel like things are moving in the right direction? Maybe they're slow, but do you feel like they're moving in the right direction?
Yes, I mean, I think why we oftentimes say, I think things are moving in the right direction, Wade, if we can actually begin to look at companies and know that their hiring and promotional practices are solid, are based on objective criteria. Then that's when we know. It's not when we have one or two people, women or an African American man running a company. That's not when we know we're there. We know we're there when the company is both performance driven and inclusive, meaning not that everyone gets a trophy, but inclusive meaning everyone has a seat at the table.
Did they have any kind of research, or did you come across any kind of research? Because I've always read articles when it comes to this kind of stuff, glass ceilings, or even they were talking about even take away, sex and race, that taller men actually make more money than shorter men. And that some of that can just be the respect society gives a taller man or a taller person compared to a shorter person. Is it a respect thing? Is it a thing that we've been programmed with for so long, or really, what do you see as the major barriers? And not just women, but women, race, tall versus short. What's the mental gap we need to get over?
Yeah, right. Well, it's the whole socialization. I mean, I think you just hit it right on the head, Wade. I mean, you're exactly right. It is that whole socialization. And I don't think it's that men are more guilty than women, right? Frankly, I think women are just as guilty at, perpetuating the same kinds of stereotypes and socialization. But yeah, I mean, I think it is this embedded collective consciousness that we all have around what is the norm, right? And you see it all the time. You go into a store. Think about when you go into a hardware store. Are you more likely to talk to the female representative or the male representative, right? You have more trust and credibility in the male representative. Now, does it work in opposite ways? Does it behoove women in some ways over men? Sure. I mean, I think those same stereotypes can create disservices to men, certainly. But I think you hit it right on the head. I mean, I think it's these embedded, ingrained socializations that we all have bought into subconsciously. But as a result, it's actually impeding our enterprise as a country. It's actually impeding our performance, right? And so to me, it matters that we change the way we think about it, because I believe companies will be more competitive in the global marketplace. I believe that not only is it good for individuals, it's good for whole communities, it's good for everyone. I just think as a country, in order for us to compete, we have no choice but to really begin to look at our own assumed biases and subconscious notions. And it makes us uncomfortable, right? It makes women really uncomfortable. When I'm giving these talks around the country, I can tell you that women get really uncomfortable by this notion, right? Because they don't want to believe that there are these sort of impediments or these inherent biases that exist. And it's always surprising to me. And afterwards, men usually come up to me and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. I see it every single day. But for some reason, and so, some of my greatest advocates have been men, interestingly, which it may not be what you might think.
It actually doesn't surprise me, because some of the people that I really respect at a high level, I don't know if you watched the show The Prophet, Marcus Lemonis was talking about hiring and how powerful women are. And then I was at a platform conference, and Michael Hyatt was talking, and actually I think it was one of the women that works with Michael Hyatt was talking about, isn't it amazing that Michael surrounds himself with, powerful women? And so it's, to me, I've seen a shift in that people have really started to notice that it almost seems like it's shifting the other way. Like they're not even equal. They're actually superior in a lot of ways than their male counterparts. So I have seen a lot of that shifting. And sometimes it is just in different, I guess, different talents or maybe that we're ingrained with. But I guess I have seen a pendulum shift, and like I said, not even sometimes to where these men of very high stature are saying, "Hey, listen, women are actually where it's at." I'm kind of getting tired of the egos of males and some of that different kind of stuff. So.
Well, I wonder, though, Wade, if that isn't why we see an overrepresentation of women in middle management.
Mm.
I mean, I actually believe that is why we see an overrepresentation of women in middle management. Plus, when you know that you have to sort of prove yourself, right? You work harder. I have a brother that says, I will only take my kids to a female pediatrician, right? Because he says they have something to prove, and they'll work harder to ensure my kids are healthy. And it's bizarre. And he articulated that, but I wonder if that's not why we are promoting more women in middle management. But yet, what's happening then in the upper echelon of companies? Why can't we then? Is it just that it's going to take another 50 years for middle management to penetrate, the upper echelon? I don't know. I mean, if it's actually really complicated issue. And the book, I think, tries to unpack and unravel that complication as much as possible. For example, the gatekeeping that occurs in Google and some of the top tech companies in the US where they poach from each other, right? That automatically excludes, 99% of the workforce, right? Because they're poaching from each other. And so it is this actually really complex issue that, again, I think does a disservice to the American enterprise.
Mm. No, that's huge. And I think that you would hope that your book wouldn't be paradigm shifting and that people would see this, if you take it that way. But that's actually our last question is what's a book that you've read that you can suggest to, the book lover that's listening right now, as far as the way it's impacted your life, the way it's created a paradigm shift?
A book that I've read that recently created, well, it's funny you say that way because I do a lot of reading and research for work. In my personal time, what I do is I do a lot of fiction reading. But I will say this, one of the books there's very few books I would read and reread again. But the history of U.S. law is one of them. And this you might think, now, what does this have to do with anything? It's by Lawrence Friedman. And it puts into place, it did for me anyway, sort of context around American enterprise, right? And he does it in a legal history kind of way, but it goes to show you that our U.S. Constitution is really nothing more than economic policy, and how much of our civil rights legislation and so on and so forth came and arose out of economic policy, commerce, right? And that as a country, this has always been our value. And so this book really looks at, and it's an old book, it's been around for at least a decade, if not more. It's been revised and so forth, but this book, what it does is put everything into context in terms of one of the last set of chapters is all about, the emerging corporation in the U.S. and how the law had to respond to that and all of that. But it really just makes you realize as a country where we came from, who we are. For me, it created a DNA for us to know where we're moving to.
Excellent. So, Tiffani, thank you so much for coming on, first of all. But before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listeners to get more information on you and your book, Recognizing Women's Leadership?
Yes, Amazon.com, I think, is the easiest way. If you're a Prime member, it's a free shipping opportunity as well.
Perfect.
And I have an unusual name, so if you Googled my name, unusual spelling anyway, if you Google my name, there's lots of information you can pull up, including recent newspaper articles and things of that nature. It's Tiffani with an I.
Tiffani will also put that in the show notes. And lastly, thank you for coming on and thank you for sharing your book with us.
Thank you, Wade. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for listening in today. If you'd like to get your hands on Recognizing Women's Leadership, or if you want more information on Tiffani, just look at the show notes at the elpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea?
Head over to the elpodcast.com,
Where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free.
That's the elpodcast.com.
Till the next time, keep it on the EL.